Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to another session. We are continuing on from our previous session on the fresh perspective to reading the Gospels, and we went through a deliberation how the New Testament writers, the people, the lifestyle, and the culture of the first century when Jesus walked, and as we can see how the narratives were written in the entire four Gospels, should give us a lot of clues as to who these people were, what were their background, what were they thinking when they were seated there with Jesus and walked with Jesus. And we are very sure that they do not have our 21st century thinking. They don't have our present day culture. They don't use our present day dictionary. Our conclusion was to help us understand the Gospels a little bit more is to immerse ourselves into their life, their thinking, their culture, their background, and what they learned as they grew up in that community. Now today, I want to take you into how to apply some of the things that we read. Now, we ended the session the last time with some of these slides. The fresh perspective is supposed to help us better understand the context, which means that the context is important, but to be able to understand the context better, we have to be able to immerse ourselves into it, be in the picture, in the story, in the narrative itself. I suppose we should also pay close attention to the choice of words. As you know, the Bible, the narratives are not whimsical words that is given to us. And so we should be careful to appreciate and understand their meanings as well. The practices, when they say they do certain things, what do they mean, right? The relationships they have between father, mother, children, in the community, with the leaders, with a rabbi, with God, right? And all these things are important. The importance of God and His Word in the lives of those people that we read in the Gospels. And particularly, we need to be part of them. I know it's easier said than done. So let me just share with you how we can get there. The idea is to immerse ourselves into the life of the audience. If we can learn to put ourselves into the audience as a narrator is trying to explain to us what's happening, I can assure you we can appreciate what the events, actions, emotions, and the thinking behind the narratives is all about. It is very difficult to actually appreciate a passage of scripture if we don't put ourselves into the narratives. We won't feel the situation. We won't have any appreciation or empathy with the people that Jesus is speaking to, or the ones that he's dealing with, or the ones who is observing him, or the ones who are being helped by him. So it is very important to put ourselves into the narratives as the audience. Otherwise, we will miss the details. I would suggest that we behave like two types of people. Number one, we should be like the CSI, the detectives, because we want to uncover the facts, the truth. And so the detectives would actually employ these methods to ask good questions, to find out good answers. But I found that it was very interesting that children actually teaches us how to look at things in their own perspective in a very innocent way, where they would ask practically everything under the sun so that they could understand. And they become our teachers, I would say. Now, I know many people have said that they are quite frightful to teach kids because they could ask some of the silliest questions or some of the most difficult questions in the world. They are the ones to teach us how to ask questions, because I discovered as we grow up as adults, we tend not to ask questions, and we tend to think that we should know, and we forgot how to ask questions. So I think a session or two with your kids in Sunday school will really light you up, because they could ask the darnest things, and they would pick on things which actually would baffle us. Now, this is how we would approach the Gospels, to learn and ask and study all these things. These things would be the culture, the language, learn the Old Testament for ourselves. Ask someone who can help us. And I would want to share with you how, at the end of the session, we could find a way to learn things in a more deeper fashion. I suggest we do not let what we don't know be an obstacle to our learning. And so let's begin. The first thing I think we all need to understand is to alter the way we think. Adjust our perspective of the Gospels. We must try very, very hard not to jump into the Gospels as if it was 21st century. We must try very, very hard to do this first part. Remove our minds with regards to what we already know or what we think we know about the Gospels, and assume that we know nothing, and that we should be like our kids in Sunday school, to ask those questions that would really uncover everything. The Chinese have a saying that you would ask enough questions to uncover all the innards, the intestines of the person. And that way you can actually understand the Gospels a whole lot more. Do not assume that we know. So the first thing is change our minds. Don't jump the gun, okay? The second thing I ask of you, and there are only two, is that as we read simple English words, do not assume that that's the meaning. When we read our English Bible, remember what I have said to you all a lot, is that it is written to help us understand the bigger picture, to get involved with what the story and the narrative and the plot is all about. But when you want to get into the details and the nuances of the narratives of the Gospel, we need to understand that the English words is just the translation of what was originally there. And so the English words may not be exactly how the original intent would be. That's number one. It is always important to understand the original context first, no matter how simple the English may be. This is an incredible temptation that when you read parts of, say, the Sermon on the Mount, which we're going to do that when you don't feel that it is difficult, we now tend to read into the text what we think, because the English words lead us to that kind of a conclusion. And so I would ask right up front that we assume we know nothing, and we be like our children in Sunday school, that we be prepared to ask all the mundane questions that you think it's too simple. And let me assure you, no questions are too simple. You will be surprised. You will be very surprised. As a good Bible student, and I hope that as we go through the session, you will also pick up clues as how you can do your own study as well. And the background of the passages are important. So as we approach the Sermon on the Mount, which is Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7, the background would generally be the few verses before, or probably the chapter before. And so let us understand this a little bit. Immerse ourselves into the narrative, so be prepared to be a Jew. Prepare to be in the crowd. And so immerse ourselves into the narratives. Imagine that you are part of the multitudes, maybe even the disciples of Jesus that were never mentioned in the Sermon on the Mount, very quietly seated down, And then, okay, let's do this. Let's pick the front row, right? And we are all excited, waiting for Jesus to teach us. That emotion helps us be apprehensive to listen to what he has to say. And this is how Matthew chapter 5 works. It begins by saying, and seeing the multitudes, he went up on a mountain, and tradition tells us that this is a mountain on the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee. And so this is the Galilee. And this is the northern shore. Tradition says that it was up here, and so somebody built a church. But over time, people are saying that they could be on the slopes right here, right? So exactly where it is, we don't know, but it's an open place, and we are there seated, waiting for Jesus. So we are seated there, and then Jesus opened his mouth and taught us. So we are there as part of the crowd. But the contextual background is what we need to begin with, which is Matthew chapter 4. So Matthew chapter 4 begins with the temptation of Jesus. He begins his public ministry in Galilee, which is where we are now seated on the slopes. Jesus calls 4 fishermen to be his disciples. So he started with a few disciples. The ministry of Jesus starts from chapter 4, verse 23 to 25. He began teaching in synagogues. Synagogues are the gathering places of the Jews for their religious purposes. He began preaching the gospel of the kingdom. That's what we read in chapter 4. He heals all kinds of sickness and all kinds of diseases. And there was fame. So understand this. People began talking about Jesus throughout the land. And so that's the background. And so as anxious as we are, we have heard of Jesus, we have heard what he has done, and he is right before us now in chapter 5. So let me ask you a multiple choice question. Jesus is beginning his ministry. So what do you think Jesus would do to connect with his audience? We are the audience. We are the Jews. We are seated down there. We are not Canaanites. We are not from Lebanon. We are not the Romans. We are the Jews. We are seated there by the side of Jesus, anxiously waiting for him to teach as he opens his mouth. What do you think Jesus will say? Will Jesus teach new and unheard of commands? Which means that if you immerse yourself as a Jew and that you were taught the Torah and you were taught the law, you were taught the culture of the Jews, and then you hear this person, Jesus, teaching you totally new things that you've never heard of in your entire life. Would that be a way of Jesus connecting with us? I think not. Would Jesus do B? That he stands up and he challenges the long-established written Torah. So I try to distinguish between the written Torah and the oral Torah. And that's a background we need to have. So ask yourself and try to find out, what's the difference between the written Torah and the oral Torah? And so the written Torah would be what is on the documents and the scrolls, right? The oral would be something else. But they're all called Torah. Would Jesus challenge that? I think not. Would Jesus dispute everything we have learned in the Torah? That when he stood up to teach us that everything we have learned since a child, that he would just overturn that everything we have learned is wrong. Would he do that? I think not. Will he make claims that the Torah is past and is passé? What that means is that will we hear Jesus say that, well, the Torah is great, but the Torah is now no longer applicable. In fact, the Torah is no longer the in thing. We should not be talking about this Torah anymore. I'm going to tell you new things. Would Jesus be saying that? I think not, but as we examine the Sermon on the Mount, I don't think we see that. But will Jesus be clarifying the oral Torah? The oral Torah would be what the teachers of the law teaches beyond the written Torah. So as the scrolls are open, they would have things that they pass down by tradition to further explain what it means and how would you do certain things. Would Jesus be clarifying the oral Torah, especially when it's conflicting with the oral Torah? I think so. I don't think Jesus is fighting with the people or the leaders who are teaching the oral Torah. I think he is trying to help the people understand that there can be no conflict between the written Torah at all. In fact, if anything does happen, the written Torah must be the one we uphold. F. Would Jesus be interpreting the Torah to make clear the mind of God? Now, if Jesus is the Son of God and he appears on the scene, wouldn't it be important then, like all prophets of old, to come and reinforce what God meant in his word? I would submit to you this evening that yes, that's how I think it would be. In order to connect with his audience, like us seated there, he would need to lead us from whatever we all have learned since young to become better in what we already know about God's word. That would be the teacher of the day. If Jesus was anyone different from the Pharisees and the scribes, he would be able to uncover and open up the text of the scripture beyond what anybody else could. That would be our background. Now let's examine if that was true. You see, I'm suggesting that Jesus will never, and never means never, never contradict the Father. He would never contradict the Torah, which is the first 5 books of Moses, or the Tanakh, which is the entire thing, the law, the writings, and the prophets. I don't think he would do that. And so when Jesus opened his mouth and taught, Jesus will be teaching something. And how did Jesus teach? And so we jump to the end in chapter 7, verse 28 and 29, which is right at the end. And this is what we read. The beginning, we are seated there. The end was this. And so it was. As everything was said on the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus had ended these sayings, the words that he said, that the people were astonished. We who were seated there as the Jews of the day, of everything we have learned, we were shocked. That was what Matthew is writing. After what Jesus had said, we were shocked. We were struck with amazement of what he had taught. What did he teach? He taught them as one having authority. Jesus came onto the scene. No wonder he was so popular. The fame went all across the land. He taught us. So let's put ourselves into the picture, right? He taught us. So we are concluding as one having authority, as one having power to teach, not as the scribes at all. Who are the scribes? Well, if you read the English dictionary, you won't get the good picture. The scribes are traditionally the copyists of the Torah. So they would know the Tanakh very well. And so in some cases, they're also described as the teacher of the law. But he is very learned in the Mosaic law and the sacred writings. Why? Because he was copying them. And so he must be very well versed. He is a religious teacher because he teaches the Tanakh and the Torah. But what's the difference? As much as these people had their career doing this, Jesus came onto the scene from chapter 4 into chapter 5, and we are now shocked at what Jesus had said. He blew us away, basically. Our jaws dropped. He has taught us in a way where we have never ever been taught. And that is how we are feeling now at the end of chapter 7. So now we are going to focus on one thing, the questioning technique. So let me just just be clear up front. We're not going to go through a lesson to teach the Sermon on the Mount. we are going to apply what I had shared with you on asking the right questions to be immersed into the context and the words and the narratives to then know what we don't know. And so we're looking at questioning techniques this evening. We'll be asking so many questions that you would have to go back and reread the Sermon on the Mount all over again. It is to help us change our attitude so that we ask questions before we give the answer towards the Gospels. And so it is a set of questions and lots of questions that we can ask. And then once we know the questions to ask, we now know what answers we're looking for. And I'll suggest to you a few ways of looking for them. So it is not a sermon. This is not a classroom teaching of Matthew 5, 6, 7. It is really to uncover and unpack some of the selected passages, how to ask questions. So let's start. Matthew 5. Now, Matthew 5 begins with the Beatitudes. We have from verse 3 to verse 12. So I would suggest that as a good Bible student, when you open up your Bibles, no matter what version you have, I'm using the New King James here, always look at the footnotes. And these are the footnotes. If there is a footnote, it would mean something. And so be well versed with the version of the translation that you're using. We'll come back to the footnote. The first thing we need to do is to ask questions, and we are about asking questions today. The first thing we always need to do is ask about meanings of words. Meanings of words. What do you think blessed would mean? Right here. We have so many of them all the way. What does it mean? Does it mean blessed in our modern day terms? Or does it mean blessed in the Hebrew terms? Or does it mean blessed in the Greek terms? So that's one thing you have to grapple with. And I'm suggesting that we should uncover the Hebrew meaning because we're all Jews seated there. We're not here to enjoy the Greek lesson, but we're here listening to the teacher, the Son of God, who has been preaching the gospel to repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. And he's saying this, blessed. What does poor in spirit mean? What does the kingdom of heaven mean? Have you ever wondered? Don't assume that it is what we know today. What about inherit? We only read about inheritance in the Old Testament of the 12 tribes inheriting the promised land. That's an inheritance. What about earth? What about earth? Was Jesus describing a science lecture about this earth and how this earth is, and that people like us who is seated there listening to Jesus, that we are going to conquer the world and that we are going to take over the earth? Well, if you look at this passage here, Matthew chapter 5, verse 5, that's A, and that's A. And the word earth has another meaning called land. In that case, then land would sound a lot better, isn't it? Because we're talking about the promised land. The whole Bible never talks about the earth for someone to inherit. It's always the land that was promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, I hope you get the picture because this has nothing to do with Greek. It has to do with us who are seated there, and we are brought up in the Torah and the Tanakh, how we understand the 5 books of Moses, how we live that life, and what we're supposed to do. There's a temple down in Jerusalem, and we grew up with this. Our parents would teach us all these things. We go to the synagogue, and we practice, and we do the feast, and everything that's there. And so we learn that it's not earth, it's land, and it's the promised land. And so what do we mean by when we hunger and thirst? How are we as Jews living there? It's a tough world there under the Roman Empire. We're not here enjoying our lives. And so we are now in a very apprehensive mode. Why are we suffering under the Roman Empire? And what would be in our minds? The Messiah. And we are looking forward to the Messiah to set us free. And hence, the Greek word for Messiah is Christ. Oh, it talks about seeing God. What does that mean? Aren't we taught that no one can see God? And what does Jesus mean? Who are peacemakers, right? What does sons of God mean? B'nai Elohim. Are we sons of God? Are they sons of God? The peacemakers are called sons of God. What is righteousness? What is persecution? What is for my sake? Oh, there is rewards. How would we as Jews understand the reward system? We are always told the modern day thinking, but what does the Bible say about rewards? Perhaps we should read a little bit about the book of Proverbs, maybe a little bit about the book of Ecclesiastes, right? Prophets. What are prophets? Naviim. Who are they? Why are prophets so important? What does the Torah say about prophets? So Jesus talks about this. So who are the poor in spirit? All these here. Who are these? They. They will revile. They will persecute. Are they our fellow Jews? Who will do that to us? What is this? Before you. Right here. Before me? Before us? Who were they? They are our predecessors. Don't you think we need to ask ourselves these things? How are we anticipating the kingdom of heaven? Why are we looking for the kingdom of heaven? I'm asking us to now refrain ourselves, pull ourselves away from everything that we've been told about the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of God, whatever it is, about kingdom. But we are now Jews. We are seated there and Jesus is now telling us, kingdom of heaven. What is that? When Jesus talked about blessed, what is he contrasting with? What happens to those people who are not the blessed ones? What happens if we are not the ones as described here? So remember, we are Jews sitting there. What is this ideological framework that Jesus is addressing? Was this a random teaching? Like, did Jesus just come out and says, well, let me just teach them something? Or was this something right in the mind of us all? Under the persecution of the Roman Empire, life is not that great. We have challenges. We are not rich. We are not enjoying ourselves. We are under the purview of the Roman Empire. There are Roman soldiers all over the place. Then that is what Jesus is addressing. What is that is so important, urgent, that is trying to shape our thinking and life? Is this about character or about you should do another 300 commandments? Is that what Jesus is saying? Think about it. The Beatitudes is not as simple as we think, isn't it? If you talk about fulfilling the law, that's what Jesus is saying. What are we talking about? Law, prophets. Jesus talked about heaven and earth. What is a jot and a tittle? Is it Greek or should it be Hebrew? Oh, by the way, the smallest letter in the Hebrew alphabet or the alphabets is the letter Yod. And so perhaps Jesus is referring to that not one else, even the smallest alphabet in the Torah is going to be fulfilled. What does it mean pass from the law? Oh, wow. What does it mean to fulfill? Because Jesus talked about destroy and fulfill. What does break mean? Let me assure you, the word break is nothing like what we think break is. What does break the law mean? Break the commandment. In the Old Testament, in the Hebrew sense of the word, what does commandment mean? There is a lot of things about doing, and that's what Hebrews is all about. What is righteousness? How is it that Jesus says that you must exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees? What about least and great? We're talking about entering the kingdom of heaven all over again. So these are important questions to ask. And if we don't find out answers to them, because as a Jew, when you are raised in a Jewish family, you're taught the Torah and the Tanakh, and you would be immersed into the law, and then you would have a particular way of understanding these terminology. That's what I'm suggesting. But then more importantly, the culture of the day, the society, the scribes, the Pharisees. And why does Jesus say, I say to you? That's the kind of authority that Jesus is teaching. Nothing like the scribes are saying. So he is saying to you, he is not learning from another rabbi. He is the rabbi. So you can see that things are not as simple as it appears. Why did Jesus draw the line between the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees? There is a minimal starting point. What is he trying to tell us? What does the righteousness of scribes and Pharisees mean? Does it have to do with the Torah? Why must the law all be fulfilled? What part of the law? But you need to understand as well, when we talk about the law, it could be the Torah, the first 5 books, or the Torah as representative of the Tanakh, because the way that people refer to things is that the head of the Tanakh is the Torah. And so, would that be the case? What do we know about the law and the prophets? And if we don't even read the first 5 books of Moses or the prophets, I guess there's nothing much to do except that we now know what we don't know. How does righteousness relate to obeying the commandments? So righteousness, obeying. So there's a lot of things we've been taught, but how does it fit? Does fulfillment that relates to the law have anything to do with prophecies? And what prophecies are they? Does it have to do with the kingdom of heaven? So I leave these things with you so that you understand. Some of the more challenging passages would be something like this. Did Jesus refine or redefine adultery? And as we began, remember we asked this question, did Jesus change anything? Did Jesus say, well, the past, we just have to just put it away. Let me now tell you what it all means. It's got nothing to do with the past. Would he be saying that? So as we ask these words, what do we mean by adultery? And I would suggest that we should understand adultery from the Old Testament perspective. What does it mean to look at someone? I guess some people have said that you can't even look at a woman. Is that what it means? And by the way, a very fundamental question, what does woman actually mean? Did you know that in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew, that woman doesn't just mean woman as a female gender? There is a better association with the word, and perhaps when we uncover that this passage would open up itself. What does lusting for her mean? Right here. What is the heart? Why is it talking about hell and perish and profitable? Why did Jesus say, you have heard it say, and I say to you? Does it sound like Jesus is correcting some of the things that we've been hearing from the teachers of the law? Sounds like that. A little bit more to think about. Why is to perish better than cast into hell? Have you ever noticed that these two words are always associated together but never put in contrast? That to perish is better than to cast into hell? What does that mean? What is the idea of hell? I can assure you it's not a Greek understanding. How did the Hebrews understand adultery? Did we ever read Deuteronomy chapter 22? Perhaps we will understand that a whole lot better. Now, this is a suggestion. What is the difference between woman, young woman, and virgin in the Hebrew? And that should give you a good time to search that out. What does lust for her mean according to the Torah? Perhaps it is not as simple as we thought. Look at this. I'll just speed up a little bit, then we won't have to go through it. Then you know what I mean. After seeing some of the things that I have said, the first thing to do is to ask ourselves all the questions. if we can't answer the terminology, perhaps we will not be able to fully comprehend what Jesus said. We need to understand who are being spoken to. Who is the enemy? Who is our neighbor? Is our neighbor the enemy? Is our enemy the neighbor? Terminology, and ask who we're talking about. What is the understanding of love and hate? It is not the 21st century understanding, that's for sure. Who is the neighbor and enemy? You see the contrast? How do you be sons of your Father? Who is this Father in heaven? How does reward come in? Because it keeps talking about reward. What's the difference between brethren and tax collectors? Maybe the tax collector may not be just a tax collector. The tax collector could be another group of people that may not be the Jews. How is it that our Father is in heaven is perfect? And what does perfect mean? Because Jesus says we have to be perfect like God. Wow. Have we ever had many sermons told that we can never be perfect, but yet Jesus says you must be perfect? Or did we misunderstand the terminology? Okay. So very quickly, let me go through a few more passages and we will wrap this up. Always understand the words. Always. Always understand who is being spoken of. And always ask, why did Jesus say, I say to you, why is this authority being put on us? He is speaking with an authority that we must pay attention to, which means that there is something wrong with somehow our current practices. It's not about praying. It's about how we are praying, isn't it? So it is important, nevertheless, to understand the reward system. What is charitable deeds? What is reward and glory of men? But I thought that was reward already. What are hypocrites? Right? What is the difference between before men and before our Father? What is really the problem? Why is the reference to synagogues important? Praying, right? Praying. Now we have the model prayer. We've seen this before one time. Remember, first things first, the words. Second thing is the who's who. And then I ask another question. Jesus said, our Father in heaven. Why did he say that? Why? What is the understanding of our relationship with God at this point in time? How did our parents teach us? How did our rabbis teach us? How did the Pharisees and scribes teach us? How do people see God as Father? What is the Hebrew understanding of Father? What does Jesus mean by the will of the Father? Your will be done. What is will? And look, it talks about a kingdom. What kingdom are we talking about? And it's to do with coming, which means that it's in the future. What does it have to do with the Roman Empire? Why is temptation not desirable? That we are asking to be avoiding it at all costs. What is the evil one? How is the name of the Father holy? What does that mean? You see, if we don't understand all these terminologies, we won't understand the prayer. As we get into chapter 7, I don't need to go through it all. Does it mean judge? So all these words we need to figure out. And who are we talking about? Who is the you? Who is the brother? Who is the hypocrite? And again, there's another two animals. Who are the dogs and swines? Why did Jesus say, don't give to them? Who are these people? What are we talking about? Is it telling us not to judge? What does judgment actually mean in the Hebrew sense of the word? What is this idea of judgment? Why is a prohibition not to judge? Is that an all-encompassing not to judge? Or within a boundary of what we can judge? Did you see an idiom? Give what is holy to the dogs. Cast pearls before swine. And Jesus says, don't do that. So what is the prescription for judging? Did you know? And if we don't, we should find out. Again, Jesus taught, Matthew 7, 13 and 14. Words, words, words. I know we have songs, it's only words, that doesn't mean very much. Words mean everything. When we want to understand the Hebrew way of life in the Gospels of the first century, words mean everything. And it's not the Greek understanding of these words, it would be the Hebrew understanding of the words, because Jesus is teaching the Torah. Jesus is teaching the law, the entire Old Testament. And what language is that in? In Hebrew. And so how we would have understood as we grew up would be exactly how we would read this, all these words. Who are the many? Who are the few? But then again, if you don't go to Israel, you won't have an understanding of what gate is. So we need to find pictures of gate, understand what gates are. Because we all know gates, we are Jews, right? But if we are not, what is a narrow gate? What is a wide gate? What does the imagery of gates have to do with this whole teaching? What did Jesus say about the destination beyond the gates? Remember, he was talking about life and destruction. There is a contrast. What is the purpose of way, and what does it mean to go in? You see, if we don't get the idea of the terminology, we will not be able to understand. So, as we go through the last passages, this is perhaps one of the most difficult in chapter 7. Who is saying? Everyone who says. Who is this everyone here? Lord, Lord, enter into the kingdom of heaven. You see all this? These are words we must know. But not in the Greek sense, but in the Hebrew sense. Will of the Father. May your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Jesus keeps talking about the will of my Father. See, I come to do the will of my Father. And so he who does the will of the Father is appreciated. And so what are all these? Right? Doing all these things apparently means nothing. And Jesus declares, I never knew you. Why is it so severe? And so it is important to understand how the audience understand in that day. What is in that day? It is not in the day when Jesus is speaking. So we are seated there listening to Jesus, and he says, in that day. How will we understand in that day? What is the will of the Father? Why is compliance to the law important to the Father? Is that what Jesus is saying, that the will of the Father is the law? What is lawlessness? Lawlessness, in simple terms, means with no law. And what law are we talking about? How does practice? Practice means keep doing it. And so it's behavioral that Jesus is relating to. Why was Jesus so serious in this teaching? And so we need to understand these things before we can even comprehend the Sermon on the Mount. I would like us to be clear that I did not tell you the answers to the Sermon on the Mount. Perhaps you may find it a bit frustrating. I hope not. I hope that you will go through these questions again, because it's all about the questions. If we know how to ask the questions, then we will know how to look for the answers. If we read any commentary, we read any lexicons, it won't mean anything if it doesn't answer our questions. And so, if we don't have the questions, what are we studying? And so, many of us would love Bible studies with question books, and better still, with answers with the question books. I'm suggesting that as good students, and we read this, we need to put ourselves in the picture of the narrators. We're in there, we are with them, we're listening to Jesus. And how will we understand it as good Jewish people? So I would leave this list for you to go through. I'm highlighting all these is to tell you that we can find out what we do not know. You may not even have ever asked these questions before, but these questions are important. So you could ask your pastor, ask a Bible teacher, read some books, go through the videos, go through YouTube, go through encyclopedia. Ask, how do people think about all these things? Because this will help you understand that when we sit down in front of Jesus, it would make sense to us as what Jesus is saying. Right now, in the comfort of our homes, in air-conditioned rooms, and we're enjoying life, we would have no clue what this is all about. If we don't even read the Old Testament, we don't appreciate the law of Moses, the writings, the Psalms, the Proverbs, the Ecclesiastes, the prophets, the Isaiah, the Ezekiel, the Jeremiah, and all those, how would we even understand Jesus? And so what we would do is we take the shortcut. We would then read the English and try to figure out what the English says, and then voila, that would be the meaning. But is that a correct way? So I suggest that our next steps would be to find out these answers to what we now know that we do not know. You see, many of us are threatened by kids who ask us the darnest questions. And why? Is because they may ask us things that we cannot even begin to answer. That we can't even think of such questions that they could ask, really questions that we couldn't even think of. Well, they are the teachers, really. They teach us how to ask questions, innocent questions, naive questions, because we are naive to the Jewish culture of the day. If we don't get into that, how then will we understand the Gospels? Are we to actually put on our Greek caps and read Aristotle and Plato and Socrates and all the Julius Caesar, and then we would sit down and understand the Gospels? I would think not. I hope not. And so we need to really be like one of those people there. So now we know what we don't know. Let's find out. But you know what? Much of the answers are already in our hands. It's just that we don't really pay much attention. It's in the Old Testament. When the Jews call the Tanakh is made up of 3 letters, the T and the N and the K, right? That is the Torah, the Navi'im, which is the prophets, and the Ketuvim, which are the writings, which comprises of the Psalms, and so on and so forth. And so, actually, if you know, the culture of the Hebrew people is all there because God taught them how to live. And so now I'm not suggesting that we become a Jew like them, right? But I'm saying that in order to understand them, wouldn't it matter that we understand what they have been taught? That what God has taught them as a nation? I think that would be the best way to start. And so with that, I leave these thoughts with you. I know today there are a lot more questions than there are answers. But I just want to show you that it is not difficult to ask the questions. It is harder to look for the answers. And so let me just pause here to give you a tip. In the New Testament, we have the Greek words. I'm suggesting that we should be able to figure out what the Hebrew says of the Old Testament. And these are the Hebrew words. All right? This is perhaps one of your most challenging tasks, but it is now available on your phone and on the internet. Tracing the New Testament Greek to the Old Testament Hebrew. And one of the ways of doing that is to look at the Septuagint. Now, those of you who understand what I mean, just bear with me. This would be the Greek Old Testament. Now, many people may not like the Greek Old Testament, but it doesn't matter. But it's a very useful tool. Because if we can find this Greek word in this Greek Old Testament, we can find what Hebrew words does this particular Greek word is translating. And that would be the tip of the day. Finding out the Greek of the New Testament and mapping it to the Hebrew of the Old Testament to find out its meaning. And thereby, with all your concordances and whatever you have at your disposal, you will be able to understand that particular word, how it's used in the Old Testament. Then bring that understanding back to the New Testament in your Gospels. And that would be the best way of looking at words. And so with that, we have come to a conclusion of today's session. Let me assure you what I've described to you here is very doable, and if you are pursuing this in a more deeper manner, this would be one of the tricks of the trade that you would want to master. You need to digest this a little bit. In our next session, I will want to pick a few of these passages to show how this is actually done, so that you know that it's not just talk, right? It's easy to talk. I'll show you so that it will help us then uncover and then look at how we can then better understand some of the more challenging text and passages of the Sermon on the Mount in our next session. Okay? Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.
Good night. Thank you.
Good night.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you.
Have a